All right, so are you ready to dive in with us today? You're here because you want to speak English more fluently, and who wouldn't? I mean, imagine just gliding through conversations without that stressful hesitation, you know? Just smooth, confident communication. That's the dream. And guess what? We've got some solid intel to help you get there.
Yeah.
We did a deep dive into this podcast, Fluent English, No Stress. And it's got some great stuff, but we're not just going to repeat what they said. We've layered in some of our own analysis and some extra tips that you won't find anywhere else.
The thing is, this podcast doesn't just focus on all those grammar drills and vocab lists.
Yeah.
It's all about the mental game, you know?
Yeah.
Understanding how our brains work.
Right.
How we learn languages.
Oh, absolutely. They had this great quote. Fluency starts in your mind before it starts in your mouth.
Yeah, love that.
That's such a simple idea, but it's so powerful, right?
It really is. It's like, think about how little kids learn to talk. They don't stress about grammar rules. They just go for it. Imitating sounds, making mistakes, and gradually getting better. And honestly, that's the approach we need to recapture as adults.
You're totally right. Because, let's be real, who actually speaks perfectly all the time?
Right.
Even native English speakers mess up sometimes. It's more about getting your message across effectively and connecting with people.
Right. And that's why I really appreciated how the podcast tackled this whole translating in your head thing.
Oh, yeah.
You know that habit of constantly switching back and forth between English and your native language?
Yeah. Yes. It's like trying to run a marathon with a backpack full of rocks.
Right.
It just slows you down.
Exactly. So their advice is to start thinking in English as much as possible. Now, I know that sounds daunting.
Yeah.
But they have some pretty cool practical techniques.
Like what? Spill the tea?
Okay, well, one thing they suggest is labeling everyday objects in your home with their English names. So when you see your refrigerator, instead of thinking of it in your native language, you consciously think refrigerator.
Refrigerator.
Or when you're making coffee in the morning, think I'm making coffee in English. It's about creating that constant mental link.
Oh, that's a good one. Almost like training your brain to see the world in English, even in the smallest moments.
Precisely. And they also recommend narrating your daily activities in English.
Right.
Like a running commentary in your head. I'm walking to the bus stop. I'm listening to music. I'm feeling tired.
I've heard about that one. Isn't that what people call talking to yourself in English?
Yeah.
I have to admit, it sounds kind of strange.
Yeah, it's a little weird.
But I see the logic. If you don't have someone to practice with, why not be your own conversation partner?
That's the spirit. The more you surround yourself with the language, the more natural it will become.
Right.
It's all about creating that immersion, even if you can't physically be in an English-speaking environment.
Okay, all of that makes sense, but what about the dreaded hesitation? You know those moments where you know what you want to say, but you just freeze up? That's something I still struggle with sometimes.
I think everyone does, to some extent. And the podcast actually dives into the two main reasons we hesitate. Fear of making mistakes and lack of practice.
Yeah, I can see that it's easy to get caught up in trying to speak perfectly and then end up saying nothing at all.
Exactly. And the podcast reminds us that mistakes are a normal part of learning anything.
Right.
Especially languages.
Yeah.
Even native speakers make mistakes. It's about shifting your perspective to see those mistakes as opportunities to learn and improve.
Oh, okay. That's a good point. But practice.
Yeah.
That's where it gets tough for me.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you even find enough opportunities to speak English regularly?
Well, the podcast has some creative ideas for that. Like, even if you don't have any, native English-speaking friends nearby,
right,
you can join online conversation groups or even practice with your pets.
Really?
Sounds silly, but it gets you talking.
I like that. The pet thing might actually work for me. My dog is a very good listener, even if she doesn't understand a word I'm saying.
It's all practice, right?
Yeah.
The key is to make speaking English a habit, something you do regularly, not just something you study from a textbook. Speaking of which, let's talk about pronunciation, because I know that's a big one for a lot of people.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that. Like, is it really necessary to sound exactly like a native speaker to be fluent? Do I need to lose my accent completely?
That's a great question, and thankfully the podcast addresses that head on. They made it very clear that having an accent is not a bad thing at all.
Okay.
In fact, everyone has an accent. It's part of what makes us unique. The goal is clarity, not necessarily sounding like you were born in London or New York.
So it's more about being understood
Yes.
than having a perfect accent. I can definitely get behind that, but how do you actually improve your pronunciation? They must have had some tips for that, right?
Oh, they did, and this is where it gets really interesting. They recommend a technique called shadowing,
Okay.
where you listen to native speakers and repeat after them, trying to match not just their words,
Right.
but also their intonation and rhythm.
Shadowing, huh? So it's like you're trying to become their vocal doppelganger.
Yeah, kind of.
I've never heard of that before.
It's a great way to train your ear and your mouth to produce the sounds of English more naturally. And they even suggest using audiobooks or podcasts that have transcripts.
Oh, okay.
So you can read along as you listen and repeat.
Mm-hmm.
That way you can really focus on those subtle nuances of pronunciation.
Okay, I'm definitely going to try that. But what about real life conversations? That's where things really get challenging for me.
I hear you. And you know what? The podcast actually offers some great advice for that too.
Okay, tell me everything.
So one of the best pieces of advice from the podcast for these real life conversations is to keep it simple.
Simple. Like how?
Well, just don't get caught up trying to build super complex sentences.
Right.
Just focus on getting your message across clearly and concisely.
Okay.
Remember, even native speakers don't use like fancy grammar all the time.
That makes sense. So it's more about being understood
Yes.
than sounding like a Shakespearean actor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they also recommend practicing for those, common situations that we all encounter. Things like ordering food, asking for directions,
You're right.
making small talk at a party.
Ooh, role playing. I used to do that in my language classes back in the day.
Yeah.
It actually helped a lot. It's like a dress rehearsal for real life.
Right. And when you practice those scenarios in advance, you'll feel so much more confident and fluent when you actually encounter them in real life.
But what about those times when, you're in a conversation and you just blank on a word or a phrase?
Yeah.
It's like my brain just suddenly turns into a blank screen.
I think we've all been there. It can be so frustrating.
Yeah.
But the podcast actually had a really interesting tip for that. They call it chunking.
Chunking? What's that? Sounds like something you do with firewood.
Not quite. It's actually a really powerful learning technique.
Yeah.
Basically, instead of trying to memorize individual words in isolation,
Yeah.
you learn phrases or groups of words together
Totally.
as a single unit, a chunk.
So instead of learning I would like and coffee as separate words, I'd learn the entire phrase I would like a coffee as one chunk.
Exactly. That's a perfect example, and it just rolls off the tongue so much more naturally, doesn't it? The podcast actually compared it to building with Legos.
Okay.
You have these pre-assembled chunks of language that you can then combine and rearrange to build more complex expressions.
That's such a good analogy. So instead of searching for individual words in my brain, I can pull out these like ready-made chunks of language. I like that a lot. Where else can you use chunking?
Oh, everywhere.
Yeah.
Think about greetings, apologies, requests.
Yeah.
Those common phrases you use in your everyday life. By learning those as chunks, you can communicate more fluently and spontaneously without having to pause and search for each individual word.
Okay, I'm definitely going to start doing that. It sounds like a game changer. Now, one thing I've always struggled with is sounding natural.
Yeah.
Getting the rhythm and intonation of English right.
Yeah, that's something the podcast addressed as well. They compared it to music. You can have all the right notes.
Yeah.
But without the right rhythm and intonation, it won't sound like music. It'll just be a bunch of disconnected sounds.
I never thought of it that way, but it makes total sense. So how do you actually improve your rhythm and intonation? Do you have to take singing lessons?
That could help. But there's a more specific technique they recommended called shadowing, which we talked about earlier for pronunciation.
Right.
But it's actually great for rhythm and intonation, too.
Right. The whole mimicking thing.
Yeah.
So I guess it's not just about repeating the words correctly. It's about capturing the music of the language.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And remember their suggestion about finding audiobooks or podcasts that have transcripts.
Mm-hmm.
That can be super helpful for shadowing.
Yeah.
Because you can visually track the pauses, the stresses, the rises and falls in the speaker's voice.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like having a roadmap.
Yeah.
For how to sound more natural. I'm starting to realize that a lot of this comes down to paying attention to how native speakers actually use the language, not just how it's written in textbooks.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings us to another challenge that a lot of English learners face.
Yeah.
Idioms and slang.
Oh, yeah.
Those can be really tricky.
Yeah.
Because their meanings aren't always literal.
Oh, tell me about it. I remember one time I told my English teacher I was feeling blue because I was wearing a blue shirt.
Oh, no.
And she thought I was sad.
Classic. Yeah, idioms can definitely trip you up.
Yeah.
Not familiar with them. But the good news is the podcast had some really practical advice for dealing with them.
Okay, I'm all ears. What did they say?
Well, they advised against trying to memorize like a huge list of idioms.
Right.
Because you'll probably never use most of them.
Yeah.
Instead, they recommend focusing on the idioms that come up naturally in the materials you're already consuming. So if you hear an idiom in a movie or a podcast, take note of it, look up its meaning, and try to use it in your own conversations.
That's a much more manageable approach, and I guess it's more likely that I'll actually remember those idioms.
Right.
Because they're connected to something I'm interested in.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask native speakers to explain idioms you don't understand. It's a great way to expand your vocabulary and just kind of get a feel for how the language is used in real life.
Good point. It's all about being curious and not being afraid to ask questions. Speaking of questions, the podcast also talked about the importance of actively participating in conversations, even if you're not perfectly fluent yet.
Right. It's about engaging with the language, contributing your thoughts, and asking questions. Don't be afraid to kind of jump in and practice what you've learned.
Right.
Don't let the fear of making mistakes hold you back.
I think that's a great point. It's easy to get stuck in this mindset of, I need to be perfect before I can speak.
Right.
But the truth is, you learn so much more by actually using the language.
Yeah.
Even if you make mistakes along the way.
Absolutely. And remember, the goal is effective communication, not perfection.
Right.
Embrace those mistakes.
Yeah.
Learn from them and keep practicing. The more you use English in real-world situations, the more comfortable and confident you'll become.
So it's like anything else, the more you do it, the better you get. But what about staying motivated? I feel like I go through these cycles of being super enthusiastic about learning English and then kind of losing steam after a while.
That's actually a really common experience, and it's something the podcast addressed directly.
Oh, perfect. I could definitely use some tips on that. So what's the secret to staying motivated on this language learning journey? So what's the secret? How do we stay motivated on this language learning journey?
Well, they had this idea of like finding your why.
Okay.
You know, why do you want to learn English?
Okay.
Is it to travel the world, maybe to connect with more people? Or could it be for like a job or school?
Finding your why. I like that. It's like having a North Star to guide you.
Right.
When you know why you're doing something, it's so much easier to stay focused and motivated, even when it gets tough.
Right. And alongside your big why, the podcast talked about setting realistic goals.
Yeah.
You know, don't try to become fluent overnight.
Yeah.
Think of it as a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
It's all about those, small, consistent steps that add up over time.
So instead of feeling overwhelmed by this huge goal of becoming fluent, I can break it down into smaller, more manageable steps.
Exactly.
Like maybe this week I'll focus on learning 5 new words a day or having a short conversation in English with a friend.
Yeah, exactly. And celebrate those little victories along the way.
Yeah.
They're what keep you going, keep you feeling that sense of progress. And speaking of keeping things going, did you know the podcast also had some smart advice on building a consistent routine?
A routine, like a language learning schedule.
Exactly. They were saying that even just a few minutes each day can make a huge difference but it's got to be consistent.
Right.
Like maybe you listen to an English podcast during your commute, read a few pages of an English book before bed, or even schedule a quick online chat with a language partner.
That makes a lot of sense. If it's part of your routine, you don't have to think about it. You just do it.
Yeah.
It becomes a habit, like brushing your teeth.
Right. And they even encourage people to find ways to make the learning process enjoyable.
Oh, okay.
You know, if you're having fun, you're way more likely to stick with it.
That's so true. It shouldn't feel like a chore. So if someone loves watching movies, they could watch them in English with subtitles. Or if they're into music, they could listen to English songs and try to understand the lyrics.
Exactly. Make it something you look forward to, not something you dread.
Yeah.
Just find what works for you and have fun with it.
I love that because learning English shouldn't be this stressful thing. It should be an adventure.
That's the perfect way to put it. And to wrap up, they left listeners with this really encouraging message. Something like, don't be afraid to celebrate your progress, no matter how small.
That's such a good reminder. It's easy to get caught up in focusing on what we haven't achieved yet, instead of acknowledging how far we've come. So let's all give ourselves a pat on the back for taking the time to learn and grow, for stepping outside our comfort zones and embracing this challenge.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that fluency is achievable for anyone who's willing to put in the effort, find the right approach, and most importantly, enjoy the journey.
I couldn't agree more. It's about having a growth mindset, focusing on effective communication, and celebrating every step you take towards your goal. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to hear from you. What resonated most with you today? What are you feeling inspired to try out in your own English learning journey? Remember, fluency isn't a destination, it's a journey. And like any great adventure, the most important thing is to enjoy the ride. Keep practicing, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep believing in yourself. You got this.